I remember the sound more than the words. The slow, deliberate rustle of a white envelope sliding across our kitchen counter. I had just poured his coffee, 2 sugars, no cream, the way he liked it for 30 years. He didn't look at me when he said it. "It's over, Isabella. You'll find everything you need inside." Inside was a divorce petition and a notice of asset transfer. My name wasn't on anything anymore. Not the house, not the bank accounts. Not even the company I helped him build from scratch. According to Marcus, I was obsolete. He left with a younger woman on his arm and a smirk that said I won. And I stood there, silent, stunned, and supposedly ruined. But Marcus didn't know one thing. I had been silent, yes, but I had never been blind. Now tell me, what would you do if your husband erased your name from your own legacy? Would you disappear, or would you take it all back? Let me show you what I did. And if this story hits something in you, subscribe, share your thoughts, and join our family here on HP, Family Drama. People always saw Marcus first. He had the charm, the voice, the handshake. The kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with everyone's admiration and half their business cards. Me, I was the woman 2 steps behind, holding the schedule, double-checking the invoices, watching his back. For 30 years, I was the planner, the negotiator, the fixer. When we bought our first patch of vineyard in Napa, it was my grandmother's inheritance that paid the down payment. I drafted the business plan on yellow legal pads while our daughter slept in a bassinet under the winery desk. But the credit? The face of Rossi Cellars. That was all Marcus. He called me his rock, his silent partner. At first, I took pride in that. I believed in building something together even if I wasn't the one in the press photos. But slowly the silence stopped being respect and started becoming erasure. At investor dinners, Marcus introduced me as his wife or the real boss at home, never once mentioning I had managed the books, negotiated the shipping contracts, or designed the early branding. Our daughter Elena once asked him why Mommy wasn't on the office wall next to the founders. He laughed and said, "Because she's too modest for that." I wasn't modest. I was just invisible by design. Then came the younger assistants, the flirtations, the late nights explained by client events. I saw the signs. I knew what was happening. But part of me held on. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was the foolish hope that the man I married was still somewhere underneath the tailored suits and the charming lies. But then he looked me in the eye one morning, coffee in hand, and said without a hint of remorse, "I'm moving forward. And frankly, Isabella, you should too." He slid a document across the table, divorce papers drawn up without my knowledge. Alongside it, a legal notice stating I held no legal claim over the company we'd built together. Apparently, while I was balancing our budgets and managing staff, he had been restructuring ownership quietly, strategically, until I was nothing but a name on old memos. He'd even frozen the joint accounts. My access cards no longer worked. My name was removed from internal communications. I tried to call Elena, but she didn't answer. I later saw photos of her and Marcus on a boat in Santorini with his new partner, a marketing intern not much older than our daughter. The humiliation wasn't just private, it was public. People who once shook my hand at wine expos now avoided eye contact. Former employees whispered that Marcus had outgrown me. Even friends we'd hosted for years stopped returning my calls. One message read, "Izzy, I love you, but Marcus is the brand now. We can't take sides." So I packed my things, moved into a guest house owned by a cousin 3 towns away. I had $812 in my personal account and a car with 2 overdue oil changes. And for a while I just disappeared. But grief has a way of unearthing things. One night while sorting through old boxes, I found a folder I hadn't seen in years, documents Edward, my family's old financial advisor, helped me draw up 12 years ago. Back then, Marcus had taken on risky investors without telling me. Edward had warned me, if Marcus keeps expanding like this, you may want a safety net. So I did what I had to do. I took what remained of my grandmother's inheritance, and I invested it into a holding company structured under a different name through a network of silent partners. That company now owned the majority shares in Rossi Cellars' parent company. Marcus never looked at the fine print. He thought he was building an empire. He didn't realize I had already bought the land it stood on. I stared at that folder for a long time. My hands were shaking, not with fear, but with focus. They had erased my name, but I had never left the page. And now, I was ready to remind them. When I reached out to Edward again, his voice didn't sound surprised, just tired. "I've been waiting for this call," he said. We met at a quiet cafe in St. Helena. He wore the same coat he had since the early days, creased at the collar, frayed at the cuffs. He passed me a new folder slimmer than the one I'd kept hidden all these years. Inside were current statements, updated shareholder agreements, and a breakdown of Rossi Sellers' true ownership structure. My name was everywhere, but not where anyone could see. Legally, Edward said, "You own the controlling interest in the holding company that owns Rossi Sellers." Marcus only ever held shares in the subsidiary. What he transferred to himself was smoke. The substance was always in your hands. I didn't speak for a full minute, because I wasn't just holding proof of my value, I was holding proof of their lie. Still, a part of me hesitated. What would it mean to fight? To return not as Marcus's wife, not even as the woman they discarded, but as someone they'd have to answer to. That hesitation disappeared the day I visited the winery grounds. I went during an open tasting event, pretending to be a guest. The moment I stepped onto the patio, I realized something had changed. Everything looked staged, shiny, impersonal. The roses I once grew along the entry path had been ripped out and replaced with generic lavender. A wall-sized poster bore Marcus's face with the slogan, "Crafted by Vision, driven by Marcus Rossi." No mention of the years I spent calculating fermentation windows, managing crop rotation, or branding our first vintages by hand. No mention of the woman who once scraped barrel staves clean at midnight to save a spoiled batch. I ducked into the side hallway toward the tasting room. I helped design the wood beam ceiling I'd picked myself. Elena was there. She didn't see me at first. She was laughing with two influencers and sipping from a glass of our old reserve. When our eyes met, her smile faltered. "Mom," I smiled gently, "I'm just here to taste." She hesitated, then stepped closer. "You shouldn't have come." The words were soft, but they cut anyway. I looked at her. "You think I came to cause a scene?" "No," she said, then added almost apologetically, "You're just not part of this anymore." I left without finishing the wine. That night, I sat in my rented room and stared at a framed photo of our vineyard taken in 1997, the year we broke even. Marcus and I stood side by side, hands dusty, sunburnt, smiling. I remembered what he whispered that day, pressing his lips to my temple. "We built this together, Izzy. Always." And now I wasn't even a footnote. A few days later, I got an email forwarded by Edward. It was from a journalist working on a profile of Marcus titled "The Visionary Behind Napa's Quiet Empire." The draft contained quotes from Marcus IV and had to make some difficult decisions. Some people just didn't keep up with the growth. I started from nothing. No real outside backing, just grit. No real outside backing. He said that while drinking wine bottled from the process I developed using my grandmother's notebooks. That same evening, I found myself trending on a local gossip blog, my name photos of me leaving the winery, the headline, "The Ex-Wife Returns, Bitter or Broke." The comments were worse. "She was never really involved. She's probably trying to sue him now. No wonder he left." Even people I'd mentored in the early years of the business, people I'd trained and supported, posted vague statements about loyalty and choosing to look ahead. That night, as I made tea in the kitchenette of my small apartment, I realized something bone deep. They hadn't just erased me. They'd rewritten me, and they weren't done. A week later, invitations went out. Marcus was throwing a celebration, a rebranding gala, marking his official sole leadership of the company. It would be black tie, full media presence, international wine critics, former board members, local officials, and the venue, our vineyard estate, the one we built together. The one I was now legally entitled to walk into at any moment as majority shareholder of the company that still owned the deed. I looked at the invite forwarded by an old friend with a note, "You seeing this? Yes, I saw it." And now, So would everyone else. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my table surrounded by old documents, court filings, and fresh strategy notes. Edward had already begun drafting the corporate resolution. A lawyer in San Francisco had prepared the motion to remove Marcus from his executive role, citing mismanagement and ethics violations. All that was left was the moment. The moment I walked back through those vineyard gates, not as Marcus's wife, not as a disgraced ex, but as the owner of everything they thought I lost. The morning of the gala, I stood outside the estate gates before sunrise. It was still beautiful exactly as I remembered. The gravel path curved through the olive trees I helped plant. The vineyard rows stretched to the fog-covered hills, neat and quiet. But the name engraved above the gate had changed. Rossi Vineyards by Marcus. He'd added it last month. Paid a small fortune to have the old plaque removed and replaced. The new lettering gleamed in gold, but to me it looked like theft. I sat in my car a long time watching staff arrive. Valets in black uniforms, caterers wheeling in silver carts. Lights flicked on across the main house. It used to be our home. Now it was the set piece for Marcus's new performance. I stepped out when I saw her. Genevieve. She wore a white fitted suit, almost bridal. Her heels clicked across the cobblestones like punctuation. She paused outside the front door, posed for a photographer Marcus must have hired, and laughed when a reporter asked if this was the official unveiling of the power couple. I hadn't spoken to her since the day she slapped a no-contact letter on my lawyer's desk, but now, watching her glide through my garden with my daughter by her side, that's when something inside me broke. Elena walked behind her, hair curled wine-colored dress. She looked stunning. And hollow. I remembered brushing that same hair before her first day of school. I remembered the way she used to tuck her hand into mine when we walked the vineyard trails together. The way she whispered, "I want to be like you, Mom." Quiet but powerful, but now she stood behind the woman who replaced me. I tried not to cry. I really did. But tears came anyway, silent and burning. It wasn't just grief, it was mourning. Not for a man, not even for a marriage, but for the version of my life that would never return. Later that morning, a courier arrived at my apartment. I expected it to be legal paperwork, but it wasn't. It was a glossy press packet mailed by Marcus's PR firm. The cover featured Marcus and Genevieve standing before a barrel wall I once designed. The headline, "The New Era of Rossi." I flipped through pages littered with bold lies. A singular vision. Born from one man's dream, untouched by scandal, rooted in authenticity. It ended with a quote from Marcus, "This vineyard is my life's work. No one else shaped it, and now we're finally free to evolve. No one else shaped it." Not the woman who ran payroll during harvest seasons, not the woman who held his hand while they took their first business loan, not the woman who designed the company's original crest from an old family ring. I wasn't even history. I was an inconvenience to be scrubbed clean. That night, I walked by the estate again, this time after dark. I stayed just outside the fence under the trees. The party was in full swing. Jazz band playing, lights strung across the courtyard. Guests in tailored suits and sequined gowns laughed and raised glasses of wine I once tasted from the barrel, and then I heard my name. From inside, a woman laughed. "Did you hear about Isabella? I read she took a job teaching wine pairings at a retirement center." Someone else chimed in, "She never really ran things right, she was just the wife." And Marcus, ever the showman, said loud enough for all to hear, "She was always good with details, but vision. That was never her strength." The laughter that followed was polite, well-rehearsed, corporate. I stood frozen. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. This was erasure, and they were doing it together with my daughter watching from the front row. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I wrote. I opened every folder Edward sent me, reviewed every transfer agreement, double-checked every timestamp, built a minute-by-minute timeline of Marcus's misappropriations. I annotated every unauthorized payment, every falsified invoice, every luxury charge disguised as a consulting fee, and at 3:42 a.m. I signed the final resolution, a formal motion to remove Marcus Rossi as CEO of Rossi Cellars and all its affiliated entities, effective immediately pending board ratification. Attached ownership proof misconduct documentation, emergency shareholder activation clause. I didn't cry when I signed it. I didn't feel triumphant either. I felt clear. Because I had reached the place no one wants to reach, where you realize the people you once loved were never going to come back for you. And now you don't want them to. You want justice. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that signs. The kind that shows up with a folder full of receipts and a name they thought they buried. Tomorrow Marcus would stand on that stage and raise his glass to a crowd that believed they knew the story. And I'd be standing just outside the spotlight, ready to finish what I started. The morning of the gala, while Marcus rehearsed his victory speech and Genevieve adjusted her diamond necklace for the third time, I met with Edward in a quiet conference room at the regional bank. He opened his briefcase, pulled out the printed resolution, and slid it toward me. "Today is the day," he said. "Everything's in place. We've activated the emergency shareholder clause and the board has been notified of the motion to remove Marcus. They'll convene at 3:00 p.m., just before his speech. Will he see it coming?" Edward gave me a faint smile. "He'll hear about it the moment we read the vote aloud in front of everyone." I nodded slowly. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It wasn't even about the company. It was about truth. And this time I wasn't walking in quiet. I was walking in seen. The gala began at 4:00 p.m. sharp. Rossi Vineyards gleamed under the late afternoon sun, transformed into a stage of curated luxury. Musicians played light jazz under white awnings. Guests sipped sparkling rosé and took selfies beside engraved barrels, each one labeled with Marcus's name. No mention of mine. None ever was. But that was about to change. I arrived in a black silk suit, simple, elegant, precise. My hair pulled back, minimal makeup. No flash, no jewelry, just presence. People noticed. A few paused mid-sip. Some whispered. One woman actually dropped her champagne glass. I didn't look at them. I walked through the vineyard path like I built it because I had. I stopped only once, just outside the courtyard where the brass plate read, "Marcus Rossi, founder and visionary," a lie carved in metal. I placed a folded document beneath it, an authenticated certificate naming the original founder of the holding company that controlled the vineyard. My name. Let them find it later. Let them wonder when the rewriting began and who had written the real story. Inside, Marcus stood under a floral arch, beaming at the cameras. Elena was beside him, tense, but smiling. Genevieve stood on his other side, holding a flute of wine like a trophy. The board was already seated near the back, 10 members in tailored suits, each one clutching a sealed envelope Edward had couriered just an hour ago. As Marcus raised his glass, the board chair stood. "Mr. Rossi," she said calmly, "before your remarks there is business we must attend to." Marcus frowned. "Can this wait until after? I'm afraid not." The chair opened her envelope, cleared her throat, and read aloud, "Effective immediately. The board, pursuant to its emergency powers and majority shareholder directive, has voted to remove Marcus Rossi from his position as CEO and revoke all executive privileges. A full audit is forthcoming." Gasps rippled through the room. Marcus laughed, shallow, forced. "This is absurd." Who authorized this?" I stepped forward. Eyes turned. Phones lifted. Marcus's jaw clenched. "You." "Yes," I said simply. "I'm the majority shareholder of the holding company that owns Rossi Cellars. I've held that position for 12 years. He shook his head, stunned. "That's impossible." "You never read the documents, Marcus. You were too busy building your image to check your foundation." I turned to the crowd, voice steady. "For 30 years I worked behind the scenes. I ran numbers, managed crises, handled logistics. And when I asked for recognition, I was told to be grateful. I looked at Elena. She didn't move, so I became quiet. But I didn't become blind. I raised a second folder. In this file are records of misuse company funds paid to non-employees, falsified invoices, and personal expenses labeled as business development. I stayed silent while the man I built this with erased me from his narrative, but now the truth speaks. A hush fell. Marcus sputtered. "You can't just walk in here, and I didn't walk in, Marcus." I pointed to the far wall where my original design sketch for the first Rossi label still hung. I never left. Security was called not to escort me, but to remove Marcus. As they walked him through the courtyard, guests turned away. Some whispered, some recorded. Others just watched the unraveling of a man who believed his own myth until the moment it shattered. Genevieve followed him head high, but her hand trembled as she gripped her purse. Elena. She stayed. She looked at me, eyes unreadable. Then, she nodded. Just once. Small, but real. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I simply turned toward the podium and said, "This company doesn't need a new story. It just needs to remember the real one." After the gala ended, I remained behind. The courtyard was empty now, tables half cleared, the sky soft with dusk. I walked the vineyard rows alone. The grapes were just beginning to swell on the vines, quiet, steady, becoming. Back inside, I stepped into the founder's office, the one Marcus had remodeled into a monument to himself. I opened a drawer. At the bottom, beneath marketing brochures and old press clippings, was a photograph. Our wedding day. Vineyard soil on our shoes. Joy in our eyes. I stared at it for a long time. Then I placed it face down and closed the drawer. The past had been loud, but the future it would speak in my voice. Marcus didn't go quietly. By the next morning, press statements flooded the wine industry blogs. His team released a formal denial calling the board vote illegitimate and claimed I was emotionally unstable and motivated by personal vengeance. He gave an interview from a hotel suite in Sonoma. Clean suit, glass of red in hand, voice calm. My ex-wife, she was never involved in operations. This is a sad attempt to rewrite history and hijack a legacy that I built. I watched it play from my office sunlight, warming the back wall, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside me. He still didn't get it. He thought this was about him. He didn't know this was bigger than both of us. 3 days later, the audit results arrived. The numbers were indisputable. Marcus had diverted nearly $420,000 from company accounts to pay for consulting fees that didn't exist, most of which went to his new partner Genevieve through a fake agency listed under her cousin's name. He'd also claimed vineyard renovations that were never approved by the board and used them to finance a private villa in Lake Como. The board moved swiftly. Legal action was initiated. Civil claims. Fraud. Breach of fiduciary duty. The company's legal team drafted a restraining order barring Marcus from entering the vineyard grounds or contacting employees. And that same evening, I held my first all-staff meeting as acting CEO. It was quiet at first, just rows of faces waiting unsure. I stood at the front of the same conference room Marcus used to rule like a stage, but I didn't pace. I didn't project authority. I just told the truth. I know many of you saw me as a shadow, I began. As the wife, the footnote. That wasn't your fault. That was by design. And for a long time, I agreed to that silence. I paused, but not anymore. Then I walked them through what was next, new equity evaluations, reinstituting ethics oversight, inviting department heads to co-lead the next expansion phase, a commitment that no contribution would ever go unnamed again, not even the smallest. When I finished, the room stayed still, then applause, not thunderous, but genuine. A kind I hadn't heard in years. Marcus tried to fight back. He launched a rival label 2 towns over, paid for ads in local newspapers claiming he was the soul of Rossi. The branding was familiar, the font, the bottle shape, even the tagline vision, heritage, heart. But it fell flat. Because the truth had already taken root, and the wine, it wasn't the same. You can copy a label, you can't fake a vineyard's soul. Weeks passed. Elena didn't reach out. But one Sunday morning, I found a letter on my porch. The handwriting stopped me. It was hers. "Mom, I don't know what I'm supposed to feel right now. He lied to you. To me. To everyone. But I let him. I think that's what hurts the most. You were right. And I was... blind. I'm sorry. There was no return address. No signature. Just that. But it was enough. Later that week, I saw her car parked at the vineyard. She didn't come inside. Just sat near the edge of the field staring out toward the rows. I didn't approach. I just let her sit. Healing doesn't happen in a headline. It happens in the quiet space, where people are allowed to unlearn what they were told to believe. By the end of the season, production had stabilized. New labels were printed. This time they carried a different crest, one based on my grandmother's original ring, a small oak branch wrapped around a drop of wine. Beneath it, Rossi Heritage, founded by Isabella M. Rossi. When the bottles arrived, I took the first one down to the cellar, opened it alone, poured a glass, and sat by the old barrel where I once cried after our first harvest failed. The air still smelled like oak and soil and time. I raised the glass slowly. To beginnings, I whispered. Not new beginnings, just honest ones. A few weeks later, I received an invitation, a regional business award ceremony. They were honoring women in legacy industries. The envelope was heavy, formal. I almost tossed it, but then I remembered the first time Marcus received an award, how he tucked my name into the middle of his speech like a favor, not a fact. So I went. Not to prove anything, just to be seen. When they called my name, I didn't rush to the stage. I didn't unfold a speech. I simply stood at the podium, looked out over the sea of expectant faces, and said, for anyone who's ever been written out of their own story, this is what happens when you write yourself back in. That night, as I drove home under a sky full of stars, I passed by the old Rossi estate. It was quiet now. No lights, no cameras, just vines swaying gently in the dark, growing without applause. And I smiled, because sometimes the sweetest kind of justice is simply being the one who stayed. It's strange what silence leaves behind. After the lawsuit settled, after Marcus faded from the papers, after the vineyard bloomed under its new name, what remained wasn't noise. It was space. And in that space, I started breathing differently. Not like someone trying to keep pace with a man's legacy, but like someone who finally reclaimed her own. My days grew quieter early mornings among the vines, notebooks full of ideas, not strategy. I stopped managing everything. I started trusting again. I hired young women who reminded me of myself at 25, sharp, overlooked, full of fire, but afraid to speak too loudly. I told them, you don't need to shout, you just need to be heard. They believed me because they saw the proof. I didn't build a new empire. I rebuilt the ground beneath me. And I let others plant, grow, and harvest alongside me. One evening, I stood at the back of a private tour group, local college students studying agricultural business. The guide, one of our new leads, pointed toward the old cellar and said, this is where Isabella Rossi refined the aging process that made our first award-winning vintage. A student raised her hand. Wait, the Isabella Rossi. The guide smiled. She's not just a name. She's the reason this vineyard still stands. I didn't step forward. I didn't say a word. I just let the truth settle finally in someone else's voice. A week later, Elena came to dinner. No cameras, no drama, just mother and daughter at the long wooden table where we used to sort grapes and school homework in the same breath. She brought a bottle of our newest vintage. She poured the glasses herself, hands still trembling slightly. I've been working on marketing again, she said. Not for Dad. For here. If you'll have me. I looked at her not as a strategist, not even as a mother trying to forgive. Just as a woman watching another begin again. I will, I said. Not everything was healed, but it was no longer broken. If I've learned anything, it's this. Sometimes the deepest kind of betrayal isn't when someone steals what you have. It's when they convince the world. You never had it in the first place. But truth, it doesn't vanish. It waits. And when it returns, it doesn't need to scream. It just needs to be undeniable. So, if you've ever been overlooked, erased, or pushed to the edges of your own story, I want you to remember this. You don't have to fight for the spotlight. You just have to make sure your name is written in ink that doesn't fade when the lights go out. And when they finally read it, let them feel the weight of every letter they tried to forget.